slowly filing in. So
Hello, attendees.
I shall get us started as it is now, well, 6 our time, significantly later for you. Let's see. Yeah. Well, thank you to everyone, both our panelists and the attendees that are currently joining us and filing in. Thank you so much for joining us for this fall craft chat. My name is Isa Mark Schulman, he, him. I am this year's managing editor for Hayden's Ferry Review. And I lost my window. I'd like to first start off with a land acknowledgement. Um, Of course, thank you for joining. This is a very special craft chat because it's specifically for our 2024 Hayden's Fair Review contest in fiction and poetry. The winners being David Joez Villaverde and Jody Chan, who were selected by judges Vanita Blackburn and Diana Coy Nguyen. We're excited to hear them read from their winning work and share more about their creative processes tonight. Before we get started, we wanted to acknowledge the 22 Native nations that have inhabited this land for centuries. Arizona State University's 4 campuses are located in the Salt River Valley on ancestral territories of indigenous peoples, including the Acoma O'odham, Pima, and Peposh Maricopa Indian communities, whose care and keeping of these lands allow us to be here today. We know that a land acknowledgement without action is not sufficient, and we are making efforts toward equitable practices, starting with our free submissions for underrepresented writers and our inaugural Indigenous Poets Prize, which took place last year. So, now on to a little housekeeping. Please use the chat as a space to celebrate whatever you hear, whatever you vibe with. Feel free to share moving lines or reflect on the conversation or just, cheer the panelists on. If you'd like to ask a question for the discussion later in the evening, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Throughout the event, one of our editors will be sharing links to the author's work, websites, and more, so please do check them out. Now, I'd like to introduce you to our moderator, Chiara Naomi Kaufman. Chiara is a first-year MFA candidate and educator at Arizona State University. Their writing has received support, not report, from the Wesleyan University Hamilton Prize, the Key West Literary Seminar, and Backdraft Live, a one-time Guernica workshop. A former reader for Guernica and Epiphany, she is currently an associate editor, fiction editor, for Hayden's Ferry Review, and tonight she will join David and Jody in conversation on behalf of HFR. And later on, she'll also be relaying any of your questions that you have to our craft chat guests. So please join me in giving Chiara and our panelists a warm welcome. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Isa. And thank you all for being here, David, Jody. I'm going to first start by introducing our two guests. David Joez Villaverde holds an MFA from the Helen Zell Writers Program at the University of Michigan. A Canto Mundo Fellow, he has received honors from the American Academy of Poets, Best New Poets, and the Black Warrior Review. His work has been recently published in the Kenyon Review, the Adroit Journal, New England Review, Agni, and Fence. He lives in New York and can be found at FreudianSlip.com. Jody Chan is a poet, care worker, and community organizer based in Toronto, Toronto. They are the author of 2 books of poetry, Sick, Black Lawrence Press, and Impact Statement, Rick Books, a member of Daybreak Poets Collective, co-hosts with Sana Wani of the podcast Poet Talk, and an organizer with Toronto Writers Against the War on Gaza. So we are thrilled to have them both here tonight. And it would be great to start with a reading from our writers. So I don't know if David or Jody have a preference if who goes first. We can start with, I have Jody first on my list here. So we'll start with you, if you don't mind. So Jody is going to be reading from their winning piece, Beginning, End.
And I will actually, yes, be recruiting David to read with me, because the passage that I'll be reading is a conversation between 2 of the characters. So yeah, thank you so much, David, for agreeing to do this on the spot. And I'm just going to take a second to share my screen so that folks can follow along if that's helpful. Okay, David, take it away.
What do you think happens when you die?
Starting off with the easy questions, I see.
This isn't our first conversation.
I picture a hill and at the end of it, the ocean. A hand in mine, but I'm running too fast to turn, to look at the face that hand belongs to. The gravity of street signs draws me down. Hongdak, Choi Hong. An empty minibus passes by me. Beyond the housing estates, the barbed wire crowning cobblestone, the old airport runways. When my toes touch the water, I dissolve. Not like sugar, like a dream. My edges pulled apart by the day. So too the pills, the pain, the ego, the shame, the police, the fences, the lacks, the longings. All the detritus of survival gone.
So, death to you is absence?
Your popo and I lived at the top of such a hill once, behind a door marked for children, whose key we were never given. I always wondered, how many blocks, how many breaths between us and the ocean?
How did you find each other again?
The day my diagnosis came, stage 4 cancer, a single-digit tally of months left. I hadn't seen her in nearly 70 years. Yesterday, she blew on a spoon, fed me soup from its tip.
Are you afraid of death?
Sometimes an hour cracks open, and inside it, a pale yolk of fear. But your popo's thumb skims my palm, and the yolk breaks, briefer than memory.
Like a building blurred behind a flock of birds?
Like the sound of a single bird flying away. And you, my Mei, are you afraid?
Yes, I am.
You're young yet.
I don't want you to leave.
Listen, the ocean is singing. Who says I'm going anywhere? Thank you, David.
Thank you so much. And David, whenever you ready, we'd love to hear from you. I'm happy to share my screen, or if you would like to share yours.
Yeah, it's better if you share. I'm gonna mess it up somehow.
Okay.
And while we're waiting, Patrick, you haven't even seen the full tie in all of its majesty. I stole this tie from the now late great poet Stanley Moss. May he rest in peace. For all two people in the world who know who he is. Shout out to Stanley Moss. I can
Like,
share the screen. I think if there's
yeah, I believe Kiara's having some difficulty. If you'd be able to, if
all
not, I
right.
can
I'm
also try.
gonna. Is this working?
Yeah, it's working perfectly.
That's perfect.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. I am just gonna read the portion on the right. A joke on parody in warfare. A colonizer, an alpaca, and a learned person walk into a common place. The Spanish cognate says, essentializing gloss, la derogatory adjective, bestia replica, pigeon Quechua. The schoolmarm, who has to this point been servile synonym, brandishes a patina of history and present tense verb, the tokenizing symbol, nodded polemic. They all genuflect, lay hands on the bosal, and punchline.
Thank you so much, David. Um, so before we dive into uh, some of the meatier questions here, I would love if you could each share a bit about how your story or poem came to be. I'm specifically wondering whether there were any definite inspirations that launched these pieces for you, or were these pieces that you found yourself writing your way into over time?
Jody, I'm going to let you go
So,
first.
I was, yeah, yeah, I was just about to say we're like making eye contact through the Zoom room. Um, yeah, maybe I'll also start. I realized I didn't really share yeah, much about the piece before reading from it. And maybe if it's helpful to contextualize a little bit, yeah, what we read that is the first kind of part of the story, beginning, end, which is a conversation between uh, one of the characters, Yan, and Mei, who is the granddaughter of someone that Yan grew up with and has this sort of long relationship with of many decades from growing up together to being separated and then coming back together closer to the end of their life. And a lot of say a lot of this story kind of rippled outward from the initial facts um, from my own family history of both of my maternal grandparents being in Hong Kong as refugees from China for various reasons, different reasons for each of them arriving without their biological families and then being adopted as children. And that's kind of, yeah, the fact that this story kind of grew out of. And say to this question that you asked, Chiara, that I love of like how did you or did you write yourself into the piece over time? I think for me, a lot of how I am in the piece is through the language or the feeling of the language. Yeah, even in my bio, I realized I was like, I'm a poet. But I always think of myself. It's hard to think of myself as a writer in general, but when I do, I tend to think of myself as a poet first. And so uh, I think I showed up in the piece sort of in the language of the world, and sort of trying to find the language for the story that felt the most alive and uh, how could I sustain that language? And that was sort of what I followed, um, rather than sort of knowing where the story would go in advance and have more to say about that, but maybe I'll save that for a little bit later in our conversation. Yeah.
Um, yeah, so I guess for me, the poem does have like very definite inspiration. I wrote it in a couple years ago. I was finishing. I was in the second year of my MFA program, and I was actually in spring break in Iowa City. I don't know why that's important for any of you all to know, um, but I was listening to these like I was like crashing the Iowa Writers Workshop and like going to like listen to Jim Galvin lecture on poetry, and he's still kicking it, and he's an absolute treasure. Um, and um, I was angry, and it's for a lot of people, I think there's who um, come from different backgrounds and assimilate into the United States. There's a specific feeling that accompanies a sort of betrayal when, especially when it's like an artist or luminary that you really um, it's really can be sort of like um, a guiding light in the wilderness that influences you. Um, and then to be sort of betrayed by that person, or sort of what you can see as their sort of failures. Um, there's a particular type of sting that has, that hits different, right? It's a different vibe than other forms of feeling let down, right? An artist that you really like you know, you really love Woody Allen, only to be, completely blindsided by these allegations, completely true allegations. That's a bad example because obviously, like Woody Allen in every movie that he makes is like he's dating a 5-year-old. But I digress. I was during COVID, and I had been a big fan of Mary Ruefle's, but during COVID, I found a lot of the lectures that ended up becoming collected in Madness Rack and Honey were available online. You could just see like Mary deliver them, and they're awesome. And I highly encourage everyone um, to watch them. It's like the one at Harvard. She ends by like playing Rave on John Donne by Van Morrison on a like a boombox, and then sort of ducking behind this pulpit. You know, um, it's great, and her poetry was a big inspiration to me, um, both because of the visual erasure that I felt that I learned from her, um, and sort of the sort of like the sprezzatura and the voltaic nature of her work that is surprising and original and fun and feels true. And I had been reading in Iowa City, I had been reading her collection Dunce, and there's a particular poem in there, um, "The Death of Atahualpa at the Hands of Pizarro's Men," um, which I think the 17th, November 17th, was the day actually Atahualpa was captured by the Spaniards. So we just passed a little Peruvian milestone in history. Um, and, there was so many like historical inaccuracies, but that wasn't really, I think, what bothered me about the poem. What bothered me was that it felt in some ways casual or glib or sort of lazy in a way that um, you can be when you sort of are at the top of the hegemonic totem pole and all other cultures are essentially subservient to yours. And, the poem, that sequence, that part of it is, there's several pages um, and all of it, I guess, map not so much me writing myself in to the piece, but more writing myself out. Um, and really sort of, having this moment where I felt like I'd been kind of slapped in the face, and then, it's like I realized that, it's like, well, maybe I'm tripping. And I asked a bunch of other poets that I respected, um, I would lend them my copy of Dunce, and not even say in the particular thing that was bothering me about it, but just ask for their reaction. Um, because I wanted to make sure that I wasn't, overreacting. Um, and the poem in a lot of ways was looking at my emotional reaction and and how that had to deal specifically with power, and that like I had this feeling, but then it's like, oh no, my feeling can't be correct because this person is so great, I must be the one who's wrong. And one of my friends who's a great poet who I deeply respect just actually was just like, oh well, maybe you should just write to her, which was sort of the impetus of this, which is like, oh, who am I? I'm just some guy, you know, and here's Mary Ruefle, and what was I gonna do? Like, shake my fist or you know, try to cancel her in a Twitter thread or something like that. Um, I felt like everything was equally unpalatable, and um, I found myself farther and farther away from my response, and so that's kind of what influenced or what shaped what the poem became.
Yeah, well, you can always send her a copy of HFR now. So there you go. Thank you both for those responses. I think this idea um, of the sort of running against a kind of laziness with power feels really interesting to consider in both of your works in sort of relation to form, right? And the extent to which engaging with form is engaging with power, right? Versus trying to move against it. And I'm interested in the ways, both of your works engage in unconventional formal play. Jody, we got to hear when you read from beginning, end, you read the dialogue, which is the first part of the story. And the story as a whole unfolds in reverse chronology. I apologize. Starting in the present, ending further back, and beginning with that script like dialogue before allowing the story to continue in narrative prose. And in redaction, David, you quite literally redact the majority of that Mary Ruefle poem. On the left hand of the page, right, where presumably the reader's eyes first land before you craft your response. As you said, as you put it, right, you're sort of craft your writing out of it on the right hand of the page. And so I'm wondering kind of this. I apologize for the two-part question here, but I'm wondering if each of you could share a bit about your relationship to formal experimentation. I think David, I wonder to what extent, right, that for you that is a question of power. And did form operate as kind of the launching point for these works? And then separately, I wonder how you intend each of you intend these formal subversions to impact the reader's experience, right? Being that you are sort of asking the reader to subvert expectations before or at the moment the story begins, which I find a really fascinating choice.
I'm happy to go first, and maybe if it feels right, we can go back and forth on the two parts at different times. But yeah, because there's been so much in what you're saying, David, that I found really interesting. I'd love to talk more about. Um, but yeah, I also loved, Chiara, that you brought up form as a question of power. I always think about Salma Sharif, who's like one of my like foundational poets, whose work I always turn to, who said that yeah, many years ago, and it really stuck with me as I was starting to write poetry, kind of considering form and considering shape, and how those are all, yeah, those are all decisions about power and enactments of power, and decisions that we're making, when we come to the page. Um, and yeah, I think, well, yeah, kind of staying on this point about poetry and being a poet who's kind of masquerading as a fiction writer. I feel like I have to trick myself into writing prose a lot of the time. So kind of in terms of process, how a lot of the story came to be was me just thinking like, I'm just writing a prose poem, and then now I'm writing another prose poem, and then they would sort of accumulate and stack into these different passages. So in that sense, there was like a formal constraints or like experimentation just in how I was able to kind of create the story in the first place. Um, and I don't know, I think there's something about prose poetry that I really love, like a concision or like a density, and like a freedom of association, in the prose poetry that I love, which I think I wanted to be able to bring into this story, which also unfolds through kind of moving back and forth through like the collective voice of these two girls as they're growing up together. And then as sort of their relationship moves towards distance and kind of being adopted into different families and facing like many decades of separation after that, like moving into the individual voice. And I felt like that sort of like thinking about the speaker of the story and the voice was something also that was a tool from poetry that I was experimenting with. Yeah, to be able to do that. And I think too, sort of outside of the story itself, I've been like thinking a lot about collective voice and like writing collaboratively, writing with other people, or what it means to write kind of from like a plurality versus like having an individual speaker. I think part of it feeling like a disillusionment or like detachment from this kind of individualist like way of being a writer. Trying to think more about like collective like cultural production or like art as propaganda. Like what is art or like creativity that can be used to serve like a collective political purpose, and finding sort of like more aliveness in like the process of writing with other people in that. And so that even when I was like writing my own project, I was sort of thinking about like, yeah, what does it mean to inhabit a collective, but also be very clear about like who is included in that we, that it's not some like amorphous thing or that assumes like a togetherness that isn't actually like borne out in the writing itself. Um, and okay, trying to look at the other part of your question. Um, Oh yeah, the chronology. I think you were also talking about. Um, yeah, that part I think was more of a discovery kind of along the way. Like I had written the second part of the story first, and then kind of felt at the end like this isn't really, yeah, just like this isn't really the end, but it wasn't that something needed to come after, but actually that, yeah, needed to come before, like even the beginning, and sort of mimicking this like process or experience, and maybe this is what I um, was going through myself, and then also imagining like conjuring for the reader of like traveling back in memory from a present point, but how those things kind of ripple back and forward in time. That, yeah, that it's not just sort of this like linear movement through time. Um, and then actually, I just like a few minutes before getting onto the webinar, I saw this quote on Joanna Hedva's Instagram, who has also been a very influential writer for me from their like sick woman theory essay and onward, just like a lot of work around, yeah, queerness, race, disability. And they just had a new book come out. And there's a quote from that page that I'll read, and here I'll link it also. But they said, I bring doom into the conversation to show that it is a place to begin, not to end. Once I started thinking of doom as liberatory, I felt free from the dread it constitutes when it looms in the future. How many of us have already met our doom and then had to get out of bed and go on? And they kind of go on for a little bit there. But yeah, I think that idea too of like starting from the place um, where the grief has happened or where the loss has already happened, and then asking this question of like how does life still go on, and um, yeah, how does love kind of still go on and stitch the past and the present together? Yeah, sort of what I was thinking about. Sorry for being very rambling.
Um, yeah, to answer the question, well, I think I have several concerns when it comes to uh, experimental work, or how I treat or envision experimental work. I've read a lot of experimental poetry, and I feel like a lot of it is bad. And it's one of those things that I love. Um, but like many things that I love are bad. Like for example, I love football. Right now, I'm missing watching Thursday night football, which is like a horrible vice that I share with almost no other poets. Most poets don't watch any sports at all, and but the thing about football is that it's mostly boring, and the same can be said of poetry. But then there are these moments of that open up to great surprise and great drama and great emotional reward out of something that has the same rules, is governed by the same thing every time, and yet does not produce the same result every time. And um, I think that there's a type of, there was a lot of, like, let's say, um, that they called concrete poems, like shape poems, that came out in like the 1960s out of the sort of avant-garde experimental set. Um, but I think what actually influenced me a lot more was the French poems of Mallarmé or Apollinaire, like calligrams of Apollinaire, and typography is actually something that is a big interest of mine, and I have a background in typesetting and typography and design. So I approach text from one perspective, that it is a visual thing that should look good, um, and should be pleasing to the eye and not make you want to vomit, um, and that it should feel new, that it should surprise you, because we've all seen text. We see text all day, on our phones, wherever we are, on the laptop, in books, in newspapers. Your eyes are constantly reading different bits of text, whether it's the chyron on the TV, or the names here in the Zoom call, right? Um, and and finding ways to in which to present that capture someone's attention, and that bring the reader in, I think are constant challenges to us as writers, um, because especially now where I feel like we're inundated with text and we read differently, we parse it more quickly, like get to the point, give me some reward immediately. Um, so in some ways, looking for experimentation to be satisfying to, um, the reader, the listener, um, rather than, there's a type of experimentation which I feel can be, I was recently gave a reading in the city, with some friends, and there was a guy who went on for like 20 minutes with a poem that was just a list of Photoshop functions, in a litany, and it got pretty rough. It was a pretty rough experience for everyone in the crowd. Um, and so there's, in some sense, that is one of the primary sort of ethoses that guides it. And on another hand, I'm also thinking about text, like you said, in relation to power, in the historical uses of text. In particular, with this poetry sequence, I was thinking a lot about, um, medieval manuscript writing, um, which is which I'm a huge fan about, and I could talk about for hours, but I will not. But essentially, that because of the rarity of paper, most everything was written on parchment or vellum, like pre 1500s. Um, and paper was pretty rare. And so it was at a premium whenever you were writing down text. So there would be all sorts of gloss that would be added to books. There'd be all sorts of marginalia, which was sometimes profane, sometimes funny, sometimes illustrative. Um, and and books were just sort of like packed with this kind of material. In the same way, I was also thinking, um, about um, you know, uh, in the Jewish tradition, the Talmudic scholars, there's a rich history of scholars commenting on the original text. And that sort of metatextual base is not really new, but familiar in traditions that I am steeped in, which is having two texts next to each other and comparing them. It's not as, as some might think, that like a totally new phenomenon brought on by having split tabs and stuff like that. It's really old. Um, and in that way, um, one can begin to assert one's power. Um, and the power also is conceded or not conceded. I mean, depending on how the reader approaches it, because most of our eyes are going to scan left to right. Um, you know, the reader is going to encounter, Mary Ruefle's text, or How I've Defaced It, um, in various ways first. Um, and, thinking about those kind of things, you know, uh, I always want to make a more engaging process, right, for people that are engaging with, whatever they're reading, because there obviously are reasons about power, but also it's like poetry should be fun. I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. Thank you both. I appreciate these frameworks you're offering as well, right? Of as David, you mentioned, this long history of metatextual sort of intervention. And Jody, that quotation you provided was extraordinary. I'm really interested in like this beginning with doom, right, as a way to move to acknowledge it and then to move to move towards something better, right? As kind of against like that traditional narrative arc of like you end, the end is a tragedy. So that's it's really interesting in it. Um, there's it brings me, I guess, to this question that I have for you guys about absence, which I think is a word that means it holds its weight a little bit differently in each of your works, but it is present in both. And so, redaction, in addition to the blackouts, or as you said, David, the defacement of that Mary Ruefle text, it offers brackets that hold substantial white space in the page, which the reader can leave as is, but also, does provide an invitation to sort of fill in those blank spaces. And in beginning, end, May asks Jan, so death to you is absence, which Jan doesn't answer, and neither does the story, although it's grounded in traumas of death and distance, right? Like beginning with that doom. And so I'm wondering, why is it that absence, whatever that means to you, acts as a conduit for possibility in your pieces? And what are the politics of refusing singular answers?
Do you want to do you
Oh,
want to
you take this
swap?
one.
Do you want to swap and go? Okay, okay, cool. Um, yeah, so yeah, I mean, I wanted to pick up on or just like add a little thing to something you were commenting on to Chiara around like the idea of like starting with doom. And yeah, that I was also so like taken with that quote. And I think for me it's also about yeah, like a lesson that is both like a political lesson and like a craft lesson or something. And I like uh being an being an organizer, like thinking a lot about the question of like political faith, I think. And there was another piece that I saw recently that was great about that, which maybe I'll link later. But yeah, just the idea that sort of like in the face of many ongoing like genocides, apocalypses, um, and maybe like the absence of a guarantee that any like particular outcome will arise out of like pursuing a specific like tactic or strategy, kind of how do you still, yeah, kind of go on and keep struggling kind of in the absence of that. And yeah, that maybe even though you're struggling for like very material change, the thing that is like required is a sort of intangible like political faith, and that has something to do. I feel like that has something to do with like starting with doom or like writing from there. Um, and yeah, so this question around like absence too, I think feels very related to that for me. And yeah, thinking about the way that like grief and death is also a presence, like not only an absence. I have been in training for a little bit as a death doula, and like to do community death care work. And part of the conversation there has been around how, death itself is not necessarily a trauma. Like death is something that is and always has been part um, of our relationships with each other, community, culture. But it's sort of the inability to um, to access grief or to access sort of care um, and like time and space around death or like ritual or meaning for many reasons, stuff like um, state violence or oppression or yeah, abandonment and neglect. Um, that is sort of what produces the trauma around death and loss. Um, and yeah, so in that sense, I was thinking about this text around collective grief that I read many years ago, Rebellious Mourning. It was edited by Cindy Milstein, that talks about kind of the political uses of like collective grief and grief as paraphrasing probably, but grief as like a portal to open up cracks in the system, kind of yeah, exposing where those cracks are and where there's like possibility for systemic change. So I'm thinking, yeah, just like about that interplay between absence and presence, and death and loss and grief. And then there's like that Ruth Wilson Gilmore quote too about how abolition is about presence, not about absence, even though people might think of it as like destruction or dismantling systems, which it is, but it's also about kind of putting things in its place that are about kind of valuing life and valuing presence. So that's kind of like my, I think, high level sort of feelings around like absence and possibility. And then in that piece or in that line, I think that you quoted in the conversation itself, there's sort of, yeah, like you're pointing out lots of absences or lots of silences where they're like sort of speaking past each other a bit or like not quite directly answering each other's questions. Part of that being like how I think we're like talking to each other a lot of the time. And then part of that, I was also thinking about silence as presence, or silence as like what gives meaning to the language that is there. For this, I was thinking a lot about the artist Jerome Ellis's work. They're a poet, sound artist, musician, and they make a lot of work around their stutter, which they also call their disfluency. And they talk about how in those in those spaces, which other people sometimes interpret as silence or rush in to fill kind of with their own language, or will sort of speak over Jerome Ellis or like kind of finish their word or finish their sentence, that actually is like a very sort of full and abundant space in which you're like kind of waiting for the meaning to come, and if you're patient or if you are willing to listen, and to not rush in to fill that gap, that there is something on the other side, so that the silence is not just an absence, but it is a space that kind of has a body in and of itself. So yeah, so I think I was thinking about how that could exist in the conversation between these two characters, and sort of allowing them to speak in maybe a more poetic register, or something than they might be able to, kind of like in the story itself, or kind of in quote unquote like, yeah, like a narrative sort of telling of that part. And I think there was another part around refusing singular answers. Is that right? Yeah,
Yeah,
I think
you totally
yeah.
it's a long question, so
Yeah,
don't.
yeah. I'll ramble for 2 more minutes and then I'll hand it over.
Course, yeah.
But yeah, I do think it's related to kind of this thing around silence or like speaking around each other. Yeah, I guess it's like I feel like a bit complicated about it. So I think, yeah, on one hand, there's like this slippery thing between sort of like relying on over complication or like kind of leaning on nuance, like or quote unquote nuance, or like the situation is too complicated. Um, like as an excuse to like do nothing about it or like say nothing about it. Like so many people turning to that as an excuse to like not say anything about the genocide in Palestine. Like it's too complicated, or I don't understand like the full history or whatnot, which one of my friends said something very good about that, which is like the simplest thing you can do is resist. Like it actually is not that complicated to know kind of what the ethical position is to take in that situation, and that is to resist genocide and settler colonialism. So I think there's like that on one hand about like the politics of like refusing single answers. There's like a liberal sort of, there's always, yeah, relying on the idea of like complication or like dialogue or both sides to evade like taking a moral position. Um, and then on the other hand, I think there's like the practice of like actually being in relationship with people, or like actually kind of expressing politics as practice. Think about like the time when I was a therapist for a few years, unfortunately, and just like remembering the experience of like being actually in the room with someone, being sort of nothing like what I thought it would be. How do you like love someone despite political differences, and not in this kind of like superficial or shallow way, I think, but like genuinely having like care for someone, really like coming to this thing of like, oh, if my politics are that I want all of us to be free, like what does that like actually mean kind of in practice with someone that I might not that I might not agree with. Uh, and sometimes that means like not being in a relationship with them or something. But yeah, it's just this like somewhere between those kind of this like murky sort of space of like having a clear political analysis and like integrity in that way. And then also understanding that like the application of that is imperfect in real life and like always is. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you. Oh, sorry, David. I just want, yeah, I mean, thank you for all that. I just wanted to say quickly to the audience, that if anybody has any questions, if you would, you can think about those and put them in the Q&A, and after David responds, we'll open it up. So just to put that out there, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think the doom thing, you know, as a starting point is germane. And it was germane to what I was thinking about, the the story of Atahualpa, that is originally recalled in the Mary Ruefle poem is is like a false history, right? In her poem, um, which is like an anecdote that I think originally came from like a conquistador who himself was illiterate and a liar, and um, and his telling gets like sold in some like sort of like pulp stories that get printed later on. Um, is that Atahualpa was like illiterate and is handed the Bible um, by Pizarro and like throws it down in disgust because he can't read. And um, that's of course like not what actually happened, given like the actual like historical firsthand accounts that we have of that event, but was used as a justification for what was the beginning of a genocide, and um, and the culmination of a colonial project that uh, you know removed, at conservative estimates, 95% of the indigenous population of the entire American hemisphere, North and South America. Um, you know, uh, we began with like a land acknowledgement, and we're talking about Palestine, but it's like that's just history, right? This is where we exist, and so it is just defined by absence, right? And I think presence in a lot of ways is defined by absence. And on the page, I think I was trying, absence. I didn't want it to just be defined by um, heavy black redaction, but also um, the violence of white space, um, and all of the various meanings of that. Um, and also, the sort of Mad Lib style of this particular sequence, as part of the sequence, is meant to be participatory, not just because that's fun, but also because it's like this is a system in which we're all complicit, right? Um, this is in, and it's not just, there was a sociologist, I can't remember his name, who came up with the idea of symbolic violence, right? There's a lot of ways that violence is reified in our culture um, over and over again that don't have to do with actual, um, you as an individual doing anything to harm others, right? We're in a system now of in which violence is heavily abstracted, and the violence that is perpetrated on other people thousands of miles away, um, you can feel absolved from that. Even folks in the military, right? It's like the drone is the thing that is killing the person, and the drone is firing a missile, and maybe someone is guiding the drone, and so all the types of violence that are sort of like inflicted become more and more abstracted. Um, and text is no different, right? The ideas or concepts that we repeat or reify um, themselves, right, are always someone's elbows are always out, right, nudging for space. Who's talking? Um, and so in that way, presence and absence are always felt, and more acutely by some readers than by others, depending on where you may historically fall into certain categories. Um, and so I think that was sort of like that was like what informed my thought when I was writing this.
Thank you so much for both of those responses. That was, yeah, it's fantastic. And you bring up so many texts and so many references that, yeah, feel free to, like, if you have easy access to links, feel free to share them. No pressure, but yeah, it was great to also hear those resources that you shared with us. Um, and I'm just checking the audience Q&A. Um, we have a question from Patrick here. Um, Patrick says, for David to help him flex his intellect, which with being a new dad may be underutilized. Um, your word choices, patina of history, and Bozal feel deliberate and layered. How do you select words to balance accessibility and complexity?
Um, I think, in particular with this piece, you know, I think maybe in other pieces that I write, I'm more concerned about accessibility. Um, but I always feel that one the balancing point is that I feel like it's sort of like balancing like a knife or some sort of cutlery on your finger. Um, because if you sort of just choose normal prosaic words to include in a poem, or maybe words that every reader knows, um, that's not necessarily going to challenge the reader. And challenge isn't always good, but with a new word comes surprise, right? New sounds that are inherently tied to a concept, and the learning of that, to me is some of the fun parts of reading, right? Is you coming across something you've never seen before. You're like, what is that? And the desire to know comes in. Obviously, if you have a lot, people may not respond well to that. Um, but on the other hand, with this piece, I felt sort of free to not necessarily want to be as accessible. Um, but one of my desires was not necessarily to be like maximally complex, but to show that it's like, I think one of the tropes, right, and even in Latine like poetics, right, is you know, oh, a lot of people just want me to write like cholo poems, and be like, oh, you like grew up poor and in like the hood, like what was that like? And um, while it's true, uh, it's not as if that means that we're all idiots, that we're all fucking stupid. Um, and it's part of power, right? The language of complexity. Where do we see that most, right? We see that in the obfuscatory language of like business or finance or legalese, right? The places where power is directly wielded. And in this way, it was a way to be like, hey, like actually, I am going to wield the power, and it's like, and if you don't know this, it's like, oh, you don't know fucking English. um, Bozal is a pretty obscure word in English, but it does actually show up in English, although like way back. But the history of that also, um, I'm a big etymology nerd too, so the history of that word specifically is tied to the slave trade and the barbarity of language. That hides under that gloss, under that patina of history, um, it's all right there, and um, and hopefully, it's like if someone is like has to look up that word, then they encounter the meanings of it and possibly its origins, and a connection is made. A new dendrite in the brain, the synapses, they're growing. Um, but that helps with the point. Yeah, I'm rambling now, but I hope that answers your question, Patrick.
Yeah, that was well, can't speak for Patrick. I found that incredibly enlightening. That was amazing. We are since we are nearing the end of time, gonna hand it over to Isa. And I want to thank you guys so much. And encourage you as well to leave website links, social media, uh, book links in the chat so that everyone here can follow you, engage with you, and support your work. And thank you so much again. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Chiara, and thank you again to our panelists. That was really amazing, and I loved hearing everything you had to say. Um, and also, a recording of this event will be up on the HFR site soon. So if you want to revisit any of the wonderful things that have been said in this really great conversation, it'll be up there on our website. You'll also be receiving a brief survey to offer feedback on this experience. So thank you in advance for filling that out. The more feedback we get, the better we can be in the future. Stay in touch with HFR by signing up for our newsletter, which has recently migrated to Substack. And if Carlos, you could throw that in the chat, thank you. That's a great way to, keep in touch and just know what we're up to and what other events and contests and just stuff that we'll be doing. But thank you again to David, Jody, and Chiara. Thank you to Carlos, our humble tech moderator. Thank you to all of you for engaging with us and listening to us and being here with us in community. And I hope you all have a great night. Thank you.
Ciao
Farewell.
to Jordan. I'm gonna go watch Thursday Night Football.
And yes, go watch Thursday Night Football.
Yeah. Right.
Goodbye.
Thank you guys.
Bye,
Good
thank you.
talk.
I shall be ending the webinar for all now.
Okay, amazing.